Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kurt Shackmuth. I'm Vice President for Mission here at Lewis, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you today. Whether you're joining us online or here with us on campus, we're glad to be here today as we celebrate the legacy and impact of Brother Bernard Rapp, Professor of Chemistry Emeritus and University Archivist, with this, the second annual Brother Bernard Rapp Lecture on Faith and Science. Today's event and the presentation by Sister Ilia Delio, our distinguished speaker, is made possible by the Cumbie Catholic Scholars Initiative, which supports projects and events such as this one, activities, presentations, and experiences that are designed to expand and advance the university community's understanding of the Catholic intellectual tradition and other dimensions of our Catholic identity. To begin our program, I'm pleased to invite Brother James Gaffney, President Emeritus of Lewis University and Director of the Christian Brothers community on campus. He'll offer his reflection on Brother Bernard Rapp's legacy and also lead us in prayer. Brother James will be followed by Dr. Dominic Colonna, Professor of Theology and Faculty Liaison for Mission, who will introduce our keynote speaker. But first, Brother James.
Thank you, Kurt. And so on behalf of the university's sponsors, the Christian Brothers, it's a privilege to introduce this second annual Brother Bernard Rapp FSC PhD lecture on the intersection of faith and reason, theology, and the natural sciences. Brother Bernard Rapp, one of our own, was a brilliant professor of chemistry for more than 3 decades, and also a person of profound and sustaining belief. Indeed, he embodied in his consistent approach to teaching an unwavering dedication to the university's mission, and also a firmly embraced the Catholic intellectual tradition of Lewis. Moreover, in the spirit of the founder, St. John Baptist de La Salle, Brother Bernard sought to touch the hearts of his appreciative students through his constant attitude of respect, concern, and caring, as well as to enrich the minds of those same students by way of his challenging style of teaching and his very skillful and scholarly mentoring. In other words, he was attentive to the whole person and to each individual's unique needs and potential. Rooted in liberal learning, Brother Bernard sought to enable each student to develop her or his full potential, to deepen the spirit of inquiry, and to be better prepared for successful and purposeful lives and careers. In short, Brother Bernard, who also served, as was said, to the university community as a remarkably effective archivist for nearly 20 years. He excelled in many ways, but most especially as a scholar, a gifted teacher, a caring guide, and a person who consistently and faithfully witnessed to the Lord's unconditional love. He witnessed to the human dignity of each learner and to a greater commitment to a more just society. Furthermore, he recognized God's holy presence in each human being, in the wonders of nature, and in the glorious gift of creation. Therefore, now let us pray. First, in appreciation for the legacy of Brother Bernard Rapp and his enduring impact on his former students. But also let us pray for all Lewis faculty who model and embrace their highly meaningful vocation as women and men of character and competence, as an embodiment of hope, compassion, and intellectual integrity. Continue, Lord, to bless and enrich this community of scholars and learners, of disciples and critical thinkers, of witnesses to the complementarity and compatibility of various ways of discovery, as together we progress down the pathway to greater truth, seeking always to be salt of the earth and light for the world. And this we say in the name of the Lord Jesus. Amen. St. John Baptist de La Salle, pray for us and live Jesus in our hearts forever.
Welcome to everybody here and those who are watching through the live stream. It's really great to have you here. It's great to have this event finally come to fruition. I'd like to say just a few words. I have a little biography, but Sister Ilya is a former classmate of mine at Fordham University. We were acquainted. She remembers very little about meeting us together. We're not even sure if we were in the same classes, but we had the same teachers. I remember an episode she doesn't remember. We were at that far parking lot, and we had to walk all the way to the theology department, and it was really a delightful chance to get to know her. She's also an avid basketball fan. I found out only today. She comes from Villanova University, so she wrote a very nice article in America Magazine a few years ago talking about their great success. So she's an example of what we would call a whole person, like Brother James said about Brother Bernard Rapp. So let me say a few facts. Ilya Delio is a member of the Franciscan religious order. She holds the Josephine C. Connolly Chair in Christian Theology at Villanova University. Her area of research is systematic constructive theology with a focus on evolution, quantum physics, and artificial intelligence, and the import of these for Christian doctrine and life. She holds a doctorate in pharmacology from Rutgers University Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences, and a doctorate in historical theology from Fordham University. She is the author of 23 books, and there are more than those 23 we were talking before, including Making All Things New, Catholicity, Cosmology, and Consciousness, a finalist for the 2019 Michael Ramsey Prize, and The Unbearable Wholeness of Being, God, Evolution, and the Power of Love, for which she won the 2014 Silver Nautilus Book Award and a 2014 Catholic Press Association Book Award in Faith and Science. She is the founder of the Center for Christogenesis, an online spiritual and educational resource for the integration of science, religion, and culture based on the work of Tayard de Chardin. We updated the bio a little bit. Most recently, she received awards she received a Gold Nautilus Award and the Catholic Press Association Award in Faith and Science for the book The Hours of the Universe, Reflections on God, Science, and the Human Journey. Please join me in welcoming Sister Ilya Delio.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and my deepest apologies for being late. I thought the lecture was at 2:30, so I have deep compassion for students who might show up late. Not a good practice, I might say, but and thank you for your hospitality here at Lewis University. It's my first time here, and it's a really lovely campus, so I'm honored to be here. I am deeply concerned about the world that we live in today. It's not looking too good, you know, from the news. And I know we all know what that news brings us, but we talk about a planet in crisis due to global warming and environmental stress. We talk about the fact that parts of this earth are getting drier and drier, and oftentimes the poor are being forced out of their land and forced to migrate because the conditions are becoming uninhabitable. And I think our earth is in crisis because somehow we are in crisis. We are people who, we've become very pluralistic in our views and our positions, and finding justice in this world has become ever the more an urgent matter for us. So you say to yourself, well, I thought this was a talk on science and religion, and it is, because these are not abstract disciplines. These are disciplines whose bodies of knowledge have significant impact on the way we live our lives in this world. Alfred North Whitehead was a philosopher and mathematician who in 1925 wrote, "The future course of history depends upon the decision of this generation as to the relations between science and religion." That is almost a century ago. And still to this day, many people think that science and religion are opposed to one another or have nothing in common with one another. This is a common perception. And yet, the Catholic Church, in 1988, Pope John Paul II wrote a letter to Father George Coyne, the Jesuit head of the observatory at the time. And it's a wonderful letter where the Pope writes, "We must ask ourselves whether both science and religion will contribute to the integration of human culture or to its fragmentation. For a simple neutrality is no longer acceptable. A divided community fosters a fragmented vision of the world. A community of interchange encourages its members to expand their partial perspectives and form a new unified vision." That last line, a new unified vision, has been sort of the focus of my work now for the last number of years. It's a question of how we see these disciplines. Do we see them face to face, opposing one another, or do we see them as contributing to a whole? And of course, this little image here gives that kind of, oops, sorry, and this thing really works, doesn't it? Okay, so it gives that kind of optical illusion of that center of a wholeness or separateness. Now, one of the persons that you'll hear spoken of this afternoon is the Jesuit scientist Pierre Tayard Desjardins. He has been sort of my guide to the cosmic journey. Tayard was a paleontologist. His area of study was the Eocene era, about 56 million years ago. As a Jesuit, he was deeply committed to Christian faith. And as a scientist, he was deeply committed to, you might say, the place of science in the realm of knowledge. And at one point he wrote, "Religion and science are the two conjugated faces or phases of the one and same complete act of knowledge, the only one which can embrace the past and future of evolution and so contemplate, measure, and fulfill them." In other words, to get a real picture of the world, we need to have a sense of what science is telling us as we believe in the things of faith. Either one by itself is like a distorted view. It's like a pair of glasses. If I take one lens out, I'm not going to do as well. I'll probably trip. If I have both lenses, I can see clearly. And that's what we're talking about here. Can we see as clearly as possible that in whom we believe in is at work in a world that science is telling us is dynamic? So the classical Christian belief is that God is creator. Certainly Scripture tells us that from Genesis. But I think, we have developed a myth, a story, and sometimes that God is pictured or imaged as an elderly male, like a grandfather figure. It's not bad, but it's not great, quite honestly. We don't want to stay there. And yet, I think operatively, for religion, many people have this notion of the ancient universe. Here's the Hebraic universe. God above, with the heavens, because God lives, in heaven, and then earth, and then the great deep. And so in our religious consciousness, we have the three-tiered universe, or what's called the wedding cake universe. And out of this kind of hierarchical and earth-centric universe, we developed amongst theological circles an understanding of how God works. So we hear this all the time. God made us. Many of my students say God has a plan, because God's the master overseer. So it's like everything flows from God. Here we are. We're to, reflect God like little mirrors, and then we're to return to God. That's been our classic story. And we have the narrative that there has been a fall, that we're weak, we have fallen human nature, and we have to be saved. I'm not doubting those concepts. I'm saying, though, we might want to rethink them in the world in which we actually live, because part of our ecological challenge is that we have been conditioned to think away from earth toward heaven. right? So, what we really aim for is spiritual perfection. We want to go back to heaven and live forever with God. Honestly, I'm not sure what eternal life really is going to be. It's not an eternal sleep in, that I know, but it's, we're just thinking that we're just going to go out and hang out with God forever, but not good for the earth. So we have modern science, which arose really late 16th, 17th century, beginning, we can say, with Galileo and with Copernicus and the discovery that this is not an Earth-centered universe, but at that time it was a sun-centered universe, a heliocentric universe. As science began to develop, in other words, we developed tools, telescopes, ways to measure, and we began to realize, hey, guess what? The planets are moving, and guess what? The Earth is moving. Oh no, that was not good news. So God was sort of being pushed out. Like, when Leibniz was asked, well, where is God in your hypothesis? He says, I no longer have need of God in this, new understanding of things. And, we can really, not that these two guys were the major culprits, but they do play a significant role. René Descartes was a very faithful Catholic-trained boy, Jesuit-trained, basically wanted to know something with certainty. If I exist, how can I know with any certainty, of anything in the world if the earth is moving around? So he says, I think, therefore I am, right? My own existence is sort of, the best proof that, there's something indeed certain, but it's not physical, it's mental. It's up here. And so we have Descartes' idea that I think, therefore I am means thinking is really important. And the body, well, that just kind of helps thinking. You have a body because you have a little head and you need something to house it in. So it kind of separated the world of ideas from the world of matter. And after Descartes, science begins to actually take off. If it's just matter, it doesn't really matter. You can slice it up, dice it up, chew it up, doesn't matter, build on it, discover it, toss it out. And we began to develop, ideas where matter's not that important, spirit's important, like soul is important, but matter, not so important, Newton came along and said, well, matter's okay. God is like kind of like an overseer. I always call Newton's God like the Florida God, the God who retired and went to Florida and then, called up on the kids. How's it going down there? So he kind of checked things out, make sure everything's fine-tuned. But Newton's world was like law and order. It's all, not the television show, but, the kind where everything follows its rule. You follow the rule and you'll be okay. We kind of have that thinking still a little bit, right? We're a little bit rule abiding. It's like, I know in church, every Sunday, where I go, people sit in the same pew. I find my students do the same thing. We sit in the same seat every day or every week. And then if someone's sitting in your seat, you get all disrupted. It's like, you're sitting in my seat. And that's because we tend to think very mechanistically still. We want something that is regulated, kind of mechanized, and that we can just kind of know, kind of routinely what to do. Well, John Hott, my colleague, says a religion built on stability and immutability, like nothing changes, it's always been this way and will always be this way. He said such a religion is not prepared for a cosmic order based on change. And we might say, well, welcome to our universe. It's not a universe of stability and routine. It's a universe both on the large level, the small level, and the complex level that's something like a major Netflix drama, where it's constantly engaged in something new. It's a very dynamic universe. And so, this universe kind of took a new spin out of that three-tiered universe or the mechanized universe in the early 20th century with Albert Einstein, among others, and especially the theory of general relativity, where Albert, basically questioned notions of absolute space and absolute time. Most of religion is still working in concepts of space and time that are rather antiquated. You know, usually it's absolute space, absolute time. God working outside, you know, God overseeing and bringing these things into existence. But, you know, Albert kind of tossed that around and said, well, there's neither absolute space nor time. In fact, you know, time does not flow at a fixed rate. Time is wherever you are and whatever is moving. So it's that the space and time are two aspects of the same continuum, that this whole thing is more of a dynamic movement, so that this universe is constant coming into being in this, what we call today, space-time mattering. And gravity is sort of like the heaviness of things that's sort of bending. So the universe is more like bazooka bubblegum than, you know, than like Legos, you know, if you look at Newton's universe. And it's what we call a hot Big Bang universe. So it's very, very old. So if you're feeling old, just think about the universe. It's about 13.8 billion years old. So we cannot get our heads around, well, who couldn't get their heads around even around a billion years? This is almost 14 billion years. It's just unthinkable. And yet, we don't know, scientists don't know how this universe came into being. I don't think, you know, it was just that God woke up one morning and said, I'm really bored, I need a universe that's gonna be really fun. So, you know, it made a universe. It's more like something, maybe there was a black hole or multi-universes, or there's something going on there in the beginning. We just can't say. What we do know is this universe came into being and has been expanding at a rate sufficient enough for stars to form and planets to form, and then over time, over long periods of time, that's one thing we learn about this universe, the long periods of time for life to form. And then, you know, after 13.8 billion years, like, here we are. Here we are, we humans, right? With, you know, lifespans of about 80 years, maybe 90 years, maybe with transhumanism, 100 years or, you know, a little bit more. But we're, you know, some scientists say, such an immense universe. Do we have any significance? That's not a question to be answered by science. That's a question that's to be answered by religion. What we do learn on the small level, it's a world of energy, right? So one thing that Einstein's theory helped us realize is that matter is really kind of forms of energy. Mass and energy are interrelated. So, you know, it's like you take a drop of water and you heat it up, same mass, right? Same matter, but it's in a different state. You know, you get vapor. If you freeze it, you get ice. And so that's what energy is. Matter is sort of energy in packed forms, if you want to put it in that way. And that kind of helps us realize why we can gain weight and lose weight. Sometimes we can look like the expanding universe ourselves. The other thing we realize today from the quantum world is the strangeness of matter. You know, I think for so long we've actually thought we know exactly what matter is. You know, we've got a handle on this. And yet I think quantum physics, quantum mechanics has opened up a whole new kind of window on, and you know, I hate to use this because scientists don't really like this word, but the mystery of matter, the kind of the unknownness of it. The idea that, you know, in the early part of the 20th century, we realized that matter can have both a particle-like quality and a wave-like quality. It exists in this kind of dual state, and it's kind of weird, quite honestly, or what someone called spooky action at a distance. But what we realize is that matter is really sort of a cosmic fullness of potential. That matter itself in this energy is really just this infinite field of potential. And that there takes an active observation from a quantum perspective to collapse any potential into a particular event. And so matter requires, and that's what we're beginning to see, that the observer plays a significant role in what is observed. And this is the first time we began to see two things. One, matter is not what we think it is. Matter has an elusive quality. Matter is this really just fields of relationships, fields and fields of relationships, if we want to put it this way. And if you're mathematically inclined, it could look something like this. Niels Bohr said, everything we call real is made of things that cannot be regarded as real. Now that disturbs us, right? It destabilizes us because we want to make sure that when I call this a real desk, a real podium, it's really a podium. And yet underneath here, underneath, the underlying quality of this is a whole different realm of things. And that's what we're saying here. One of the aspects of quantum physics that really got Albert Einstein, I call Albert by first name since I talk about him so much, kind of really unhappy, was this idea that if you take two particles that have interacted and you split them apart, and say you put one particle here on the podium at Lewis University and the other particle, let's say on the planet Venus. If you turn this particle 180 degrees up, it was speculated the particle on Venus would turn 180 degrees downward. They were complementary and related to one another. And Albert said, no way. God does not play dice like this. This is not chancy stuff. This is too weird for me. And his students, it's always good to have good postdoc students. They said, no, Albert, I think this is true. I think these two particles are entangled with each other. And sure enough, the experiments were later performed that, particles that have been separated can mutually affect one another. We call this entanglement, or spooky action at a distance. And Henry Stapp, Henry Stapp, the physicist, says even our thoughts are entangled. Say you're thinking, say you worked with someone or you lived with someone and that person moved away. And you go one day, gee, I wonder how Pat is doing, And then within half an hour, the phone rings, or you get an email, it's from Pat. And we used to say in the old world, it was what a coincidence, I was just thinking about you. Now you can say, we are quantumly entangled. So it depends who your friends are and who you interact with. And we're learning today that everything interacts with everything else. That's the kind of world we're living in. And so what we realize today is that cosmic life is intrinsically relational. Relationships are not just something we do or have, it's what we are. And so we can speak of the universe as undivided wholeness, and we humans are part and parcel of this wholeness. It's so interconnected that Paul Dirac said in 1933 at one of those thank you dinners, he said, it's so relational that if you pick a flower on Earth, you will move the farthest star. Now that's not a scientific statement, that's a descriptive statement to try to make the point that our actions, our thoughts, our lives affect everything else in the universe as we are affected by everything else. So this led my hero, Tayard, to say, well, maybe it's not a metaphysics, like God is above, kind of governing, or there's this principle of being, which we participate in, but he said, everything is coming into being, including God. Now there we have, what? And so he spoke of this as a hyperphysics. He says the principle of life in this universe that is unfolding and moving towards something, he said, the principle is the future, the openness of life to more life. And we still haven't gotten our heads around that one. That what supports us is the future. And I take the future not as a time dimension, but as the realm of infinite possibilities. And so part of that story now, part of this new story that begins to kind of emerge through the writings of Tayard and Whitehead and others, is that we're living in a world of deep connectivity where consciousness plays a fundamental role in what exists. And you think to yourself, no way. I mean, come on. We don't even know what consciousness is. And that's part of the problem. And the journey, you might say. This is Bertrand Russell. He looks quite, reflective here. He says, we know nothing about the intrinsic quality of physical events except when these are mental events that we directly experience. Or as Thomas Nagel says, who knows what it's like to be a bat? We don't know. We don't even know what it's like to be another person. All we know is that other person, right? Or this event. In having conscious experience, we learn something about the intrinsic nature of physical stuff. For conscious experience is itself a form of physical stuff. And you go, huh? What does that mean, right? What does that mean? So Max Planck might help us a little. He says, I regard consciousness as fundamental. Matter, here's the key point, matter is derivative from consciousness. And you go, Max, what were you drinking when you wrote this, right? Matter is derivative from consciousness. Well, he's thinking in terms of quantum physics, right? That what exists is a wave-particle duality, but it's only when the observer makes an act of determination. Oh, the particle is here, that potential particle comes into existence. He said we cannot get behind consciousness. Everything we talk about, everything we regard as existing begins with consciousness. Well, it's true. How can we get rid of consciousness? We can't. Everything begins with awareness. And we might say awareness and experience. David Bohm, who wrote this wonderful book called Implicate Order, really builds on these ideas, and he says the notion of reality as a whole should be such to allow an understanding for how reality includes both mind and matter, consciousness and that which is related. And that's part of this holism, this new idea of holism that's today. Mind is not something that's outside us or something that, we were inert particles and all of a sudden one day we, emerged into having minds. Mind is part and parcel of materiality. That's part of the new understanding here. So what we're saying is matter, every aspect of matter has some form of consciousness or mind. Even Ilya Prigogine would even say chemical reactions have some sort of awareness. And that just seems how is that possible? But we don't know. We have to go back and say, what do we mean by consciousness? And it means some kind of informational flow or something's going on that's fundamental to matter itself. Whatever it is, what we realize is that the holistic relationship between mind and matter is that everyone is sharing both mind and matter. So as human beings and societies, Bohm said, we seem separate. We do seem like separate and we act separately. But in our roots, we are part of an indivisible whole and share in the same cosmic process. Everyone shares in the same cosmic process of mind-matter holism that is seeking to become something whole, more whole, in this process that we call evolution. Evolution is one of those words that kind of has led to oppositions. People ask me, do you believe in evolution? I said, evolution is not a belief system. It's the best way we can describe how complex life has unfolded. And that's really what we're talking about here. The word itself comes from the Latin evolvere, like a scroll. You're unfolding something. And therefore, we're saying that life isn't just, it's not a given, right? It's not just fixed. It's rather dynamic, it changes, and it can become something new. So we humans, in that sense, we emerge after a long period of biological life. And if we were to look at where we fit into this scheme of things, think of the whole Big Bang story into biological life as like 30 books of, an encyclopedia of 30 books, where each book has 450 pages, and each page is 1,000,000 years. You got that? That is one big book. Volume 1 is the Big Bang. Now, 20 volumes later is Earth. So what's happening, for those 20 volumes, Something that can make Earth happen. Volume 22, life on Earth. I mean, we're talking the beginning of life. Not until volume 29 do we get to the Cambrian period. Now check this out. Volume 30, which is our volume, the dinosaurs go extinct on page 385. Now there's 450 pages in this volume. So our nearer cousins are dinosaurs. I'm like, are you kidding? Really? Of course, I do have a cousin that might look like one, but, Volume 30, page 390, the mammals appear. I mean, those are whales, the thing. Okay, here we are. Volume 30, page 450, the last line. And the last 2 words of the last line. Human beings. Human beings. And guess what? There's no period. There's no period. It doesn't say, thank you for reading this book, kind of the conclusion to the book. We are currently in the story of evolution. And we've got to get our heads around it. So first thing we have to recognize is that we're unfinished. Now that could be good news. That probably was Jesus' good news, quite honestly. He could have said that way. It would have been easier, but we're unfinished. We're in a process of becoming something, and that should be hopeful for us. So it's not about, we failed, oh, it's all over. How many times I hear this, it's all over, we're going downhill, I'm like, no, it's just waking up. We're just beginning. We are being created as we create. So we play an active role in our own becoming. Life emerges toward newness. That's the whole story of the Big Bang universe and evolution. Give it enough time, new things will happen. And it's an irreversibility of time. I can't tell you how many people I remember the good old days, remember what was. Well, what was is. That is how time works. What the old is taken up into the new, and the new is standing on the cusp of the future. And therefore, life evolves by creative power. The future belongs to those who are creative, inventive, discoverers, and willing to trust, the power within. So in Tayard's view, that he says we're moving towards more complex conscious life. That's what's been happening all along. As you move from, say, 4-legged creatures into 2-legged creatures into the many different iterations of the Homo species, from Australopithecines to Nephelida to Homo sapiens. We keep getting more complex brains and higher consciousness. So that, of course, I just want to point out here, our fastest evolver today is technology. The one thing that is rapidly, in a sense, moving us into greater levels of complexity and consciousness is technology. And we have to deal with that in our own human becoming. Tayard asked the question, does evolution have a direction? This is a question for us. Are we going somewhere? And it's a question that science can answer on its own. Many scientists will say, no, evolution is just the way we explain our existence. But Tayard noticed a pattern. He says we're moving from simple cellular life into more complex life. And that's where he will see God has a role in what's taking shape here. So he asks at one point, and here is a key question. The word God really is a name that points to the whole of reality, or as the theologian Karl Rahner would say, the absolute mystery. Tayard looked at the word God as that wholeness that is in a sense empowering this universe and this universe to become more whole. But he says we do not yet have an adequate story about God in evolution. So he asks, who will give evolution its own God? And he says people are looking for a religion of humankind and earth today which gives meaning to our achievements, a religion that will kindle cosmic and human evolution and a deep sense of commitment to the earth. Basically, he's saying we've had a story of God that is so otherworldly, it has shifted our attention away from the earth and towards this place of heaven. And he says, no longer can we really think this way. So he borrows from what quantum physics is telling us, and he places that within the story of evolution. And he says, look, first of all, mind and matter are two aspects of the same reality. So he says every particle, every lepton, every quark, every cell has an inner dimension and an outer dimension. So everything has a level of mind or consciousness, everything has a level of attraction. And you can think of this universe as twofold, or what he called bifacial, inner, outer, inner, outer. And this whole thing is evolving into greater complexity, into greater levels of relationship. And he says at one point, this inner side of evolution, this mindful nature of matter, he said, makes religion a natural part, a natural phenomenon. Evolution has a transcendent depth by nature. It has mind. It's constantly, in a sense, aware of something beyond itself. So he says religion and evolution are destined to form something together, one single continuous organism. And that's hard to get our heads around, that religion and biological evolution belong together. And we say to ourselves, what does that really mean? Because we're so used to talking about God and the things of God apart from evolution or science. So here's how he puts it. He says there is this principle of wholeness that he calls omega, the whole. In the scripture we read, I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am the beginning and the end. In a sense, we could say the end is already in the beginning. The whole of which, we anticipate. We can call that the reign of God or whatever. It's already sort of here in seed form. There's the beginnings of it. And he says this principle of wholeness is throughout every level of life. And he says what keeps this whole moving is an energy that we can name as love. So he speaks of love as the core energy of the universe. So we can put it this way, that this is a universe that's not brute matter. This is a universe that has a core of love at the heart of it. An energy of attraction that keeps pulling everything into more relationships of unity. And therefore, Tayard likens that to God as love, right? That's what we read in the New Testament. So we're saying that God is that central power of love, we can say, at the heart of a universe that is becoming something more whole, more complex, more conscious. And therefore, we can speak of this God not as hovering over us, but it's entangled with us. A God, that's what love does, right? Love doesn't leave the lover out there to fend for yourself, I really love you, but go make your own, make it on your own, and then let me know how it goes. This is a God who's deeply related. So God, we can say, is that wellspring of love, deeply related to every aspect of this material world, and therefore entangled. But that love gives freedom to what we can become, right? Love never controls. Love always empowers and sets free. So Tayard said, God and the world are working together. They form a whole, and the whole is in evolution. And that leads him to say that God is truly related to the world. God is not just hovering above the world. God is not just apathetic, like, oh, too bad, you messed it up, you'll have to fix it up. God is really affected by the world, he says. God and the world form a complementary pair. So God affects the world, and the world affects God. I think that's something we have yet to really get our heads around, because we think that sort of God is indifferent, maybe, to what this world becomes. And Tayard's saying, no, the world actually affects what God becomes in this here. So he puts this in the language of what the Franciscans called the primacy of Christ. In other words, God is that infinite power of love that from all eternity willed to love in a finite way, a creature, in a creaturely way. Love is always particular. And so we see that, as Tayard envisioned, as Duns Scotus said, Christ is first in God's intention to love. So sin is not the reason for this creation, in Tayard's view. Love is the reason. We can say this very simply: we are created to love. It's what drives everything in Tayard's view. It's the core energy of the universe, and it is what is to become conscious and enacted in the human person. Jesus did so in a particular way. So Tayard says, God is not, there's no God, there's no like big being over us. That what God is that wholeness of in being love is emptied into the material world. We read that in Philippians. Though he was in the form of God, Jesus did not deem equality with God. Love gives itself away. That's what perfect love does. Love is self-emptying. So God becomes flesh, becomes element, and draws all things through love into the fullness of being. Meaning that, put it this another way, every quark, every lepton, every cell, every amoeba, every leaf, every tree, everything that exists is God's being in love. Everything has a depth of love to it, and it has its own beauty, right? It has its own magnificence. So for Tayard, we take hold of God in the finite. Matter matters to God, putting that in a very simple way. And therefore, we can begin to see this story in terms of who Jesus is and what Jesus is about. It's not that we had, a perfect garden from which we fell. It's that we have the capacity to become a garden of flourishing life. And Jesus is the one who emerges out of this long span of evolutionary life. So it's hard for us to imagine that Jesus of Nazareth, comes by way of evolution, but that indeed is. I mean, if he's truly human, this is part of the narrative. What we find in Jesus, however, is what we learn about matter itself. Jesus has a new mind, right? So we're so used to reading the Gospels in a particular way. We're invited to look at the New Testament story with different eyes now, as science now holds out a new picture of this cosmic universe. And then we can say, well, what's Jesus about in this Big Bang universe? And what we see is he emerges on the scene like he's Jewish, for one thing. He's not Catholic, all right? He's Jewish. He comes with a mind of the presence of God, and he does really outrageous things. He walks into the temple and he begins to read from the Torah, something that only the rabbis would do. And so there's something about this mindfulness of Jesus that moves him to act from a new center. In Jesus, we find the faithful Jew, the responsible individual, and yet this intense experience of God. So what we see is this consciousness of God's presence in his life liberates him to accept, the freedom and responsibility to act out of this God-centered life. Carl Jung, the famous psychiatrist of the 20th century, was disturbed, actually, by Christianity, as was Tayard. They felt it had become so removed from normal everyday life. It became so individualized. It became so kind of apathetic to the world in some ways, that he began to reread the New Testament in terms of consciousness. And so he talks about Christ as the symbol of the whole self. And there's something about Jesus that does have that sense of totality. You know, he lives as a whole. And what, Jung said is without integration of the self, there is no totality. We know that today, right? So we know that if we're not together within ourselves, our minds are one place, our hearts are another place, and our bodies are who knows where, we don't have a sense of the whole person. Jesus is the whole person. His mind is centered in God, God is centered in his body, and the whole body is centered in the community. This is the process of individuation. So what Tayard and Jung speak about is how are we saved? Salvation, means to be made whole. It's a healing process. It's not a rescue plan. It's not like, gee, this is a fallen world, we need God to rescue us from it. It is rather, we are to be made whole within ourselves to be part of the whole that is seeking to emerge in and through our lives. So Christ symbolizes that wholeness. And he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Like, I, in a sense, show, what this means to be in touch with God within, and then to act from a God-centered life. So Tayard says, we will be saved by an option that has chosen the whole. And that really takes relational holism, this mind-matter whole, and brings it into the level of the human person who now exists within a community and an earth community. An option that has chosen the whole. Do we choose the whole at all? Do we choose to become whole within ourselves? Do we choose to help make our communities whole? Do we help make the earth whole? And so this kind of movement towards wholeness is actually what the word Catholic in its root meaning means. To be Catholic means to have a consciousness of the whole, katholikos or kataholos. So Jesus is a step in this movement or this evolution towards wholeness, but it doesn't end with him, right? He says in the Gospel of John, "Amen, I say to you, the one who believes in me will also do the works I do, and in fact, will do greater works than these because I go to the Father." Greater works. Jesus then says, recognizes in some ways the limits of his humanity, but sends the Spirit to empower us to continue as humans this work of God. So what we realize today is in this unfolding life, this Big Bang universe, energized, dynamized, interconnected, that's unfinished, that we're here as co-creators. We make a difference to what this world becomes. We are not passive spectators. We are not innocent bystanders. Biological evolution has not ended with us. We're not the end of the story. We are, in a sense, a line in the story. And Jesus sort of, he, in a sense, its own way, kind of points to this proleptically by saying new wine must be put into new wineskins, right? Don't look back, he says. Put your hand to the plow and move forward. And that moving forward requires us to let go, right? We cannot stay with old paradigms, old ways of thinking, static ways of thinking, old images of God. We want, to be in a safe spot with God. That's not God. That's you or me, right? We want our safety. God is an adventure in love. And so Eric Jong said, to live with an evolutionary spirit is to let go when the right time comes and to engage in new structures of relationship. How do we know when the right time comes to engage new structures of relationship? So my last part is just recognizing that where your mind is, there the rest of you lies, right? Where your heart is, there your treasure lies, Jesus says. The Buddha says our minds create the world, not the other way around. And that's very consonant with what we're learning today from quantum physics. Consciousness is the name of the game, so to speak, or the name of matter. So how we think, how we decide. Tayard thought that the love of God was to build the soul, and to build the soul was to expand in knowledge. It's the mind, as we seek to form new horizons of meaning, as we seek to discover, as we seek to know. He said forming hypothesis is a supreme spiritual act. Study is a spiritual act. Scientific discovery is a spiritual act. God is a power calling the mind, he said, to bring a new unity into being. Every act of knowing is an act of synthesis, which makes knowledge a prime mover in the evolution of the universe. And not just sheer information, not something that a chat GPT could spit out for you. You as the human person are the knower. It matters that you form a new synthesis and grapple with ideas. What's forming? What is the whole that is forming as your horizon of insight? So Tayard has this idea of the mysticism, in other words, to find that which is hidden and bring it to light. That's what we mean here by mysticism. It's intellectually creative. It begins with a world not understood and comes to know God at the point where experience lights up the fire of knowledge. In other words, God is emerging. Emerging by this, I mean as if waking up, as if we're in the dark, and as we begin to know and realize new holes and see in a new way, God can come to light in that new vision. So Tayard says, we are the rising up of God in evolution. When our minds and hearts expand in love, God is born in us and through us into the universe, because the universe then is moving ever more closer to greater wholeness, omega. And truthfully, this is really what the Christ is about. So basically, Tayard's vision here, and I think this is important for us in our own time, it's not just getting a job or getting through 4 years of education. It's building the soul. The soul may be our most precious focus today, the inner life. We're losing the inner life. It's flattening out. We're all over the place, quite honestly. Contemplation is that centering within oneself, you might say, focusing the mind, and therefore contemplation as building up the energy within. Who do I love? What do I exist for? Who is the ground of my own life? Who is my God? Right? And so, centrating our energy so that we can face the challenges within our midst. Beatrice Buteau said, the more conscious we become, the more person we become. We move from individual to person. Person is a relational being. And the more we become person, the more we live by the life of the whole. Persons live in relationships, relationships create wholeness. And therefore, we have to deepen consciousness to live in that wholeness. We are living in a rapidly accelerating technological age when the opposite movements are taking place. We're thinning out, actually, our interior lives. We're thinning out our minds. We're exporting our minds into devices. The phone, the computer is now the exoskeletal self. And so I love technology, believe me. It's not technology, there's something about technology that has it in its grip. And one of the maxims of transhumanism is technology will fulfill what religion promises. Deep down, we do not have a vital religious spirit. We have a sort of a methodical religion, or something that keeps us safe and feeling, secure, but not a religion that animates all that we're about in a universe that is seeking to become ever more whole. And so, Tayard, like Raymond Poincaré says, we must begin to know the Christ from the inside. That means coming to within our own depths, allowing our minds to become whole. That means facing our difficulties, our darknesses, our challenges. Raymond Poincaré said, I discover myself as the thou of an I. God is the I, and I am God's thou. When we know God from within, that power of love, we know we're not alone. And that being with, not one but two, but not one, both one and two, it's the mystery of who we are. Really, that power of God within gives us the power then to embrace the world and engage it without. Poincaré says every person can manifest the Christ. Every single person has that divine love within. Every person is a child of God and thus part of God's outpouring love. Everyone has the capacity to be unified in that divine dimension of life. Thomas Merton thought if we could really believe that God is doing new things within us and among us, that this power of love is moving this universe towards something more whole and more engaging, he said, which is what the Christ is, that love incarnate. He said, belief in the Christ risen, love at the heart of every aspect of matter, is not an obstacle to encounter world religions. It is the very means of furthering this encounter. The Christ in me recognizes the Christ in you. And therefore, we have a basis to begin to build something more together. So all of this to say is several things. One, it's a fantastic universe of immense proportions that is dynamized, energized. It's unfinished. It's moving towards something. Science cannot tell us by itself what we're created for, what we're here for in this very long span of life. Scripture does hold out for us. As Whitehead said, God has a vision, right? But God will not do anything for us without us, right? God is that power of love, that infinite potential of love, but that love must be actualized. It needs a face and it needs hands, it needs a body to become real, to become fully known. And therefore, we have the capacity to bring this universe into a greater unity, a Christified universe unfolding in and through us. We are God's becoming, meaning that God becomes known in the world as we, in a sense, become entangled with that life of God within us and among us. Sin, we might say, is living in the exile of unrelatedness. I don't want to be involved. I don't really care about the whole. I want to resist all this whole-making stuff. I'm going to go to my room, stick with my computer and my phone, and I'll text everyone, right? Life is messy. Evolution, by the way, is messy. A lot of suffering, a lot of death. And here we are, after long, long periods of suffering and death. Here we are. There's something about life at the heart of this universe of life that cannot be quenched. That is the faith in a power of love that we name as God. So we have a choice to make. Are we going to just allow ourselves to be taken up by a technological sweeping of transhuman life into new dualisms, where if you can afford the technologies, you'll be saved, and if you can't afford them, you'll be lost? Or do we take the insights from science? We're part of a cosmic whole, a relational whole. And from a religious perspective, we realize God is the power of that whole, calling us, pushing us to actualize love, to become free, to become creative, to become energetic, to become daring, to become risk takers, to become people who push the margins into the future, to say we have a vision, we have a hope, a new whole for this planet, a whole of justice, a whole of sustainability, a whole where future generations can then anticipate more life. The Christian story is very simple, I think. God said, see, I am making all things new. Jesus, the Christ, in his risenness, right, is about a new life at the heart of God, We are called to be a new people, a Christified people. And if we want a different world, then we are going to have to become a different people. Thank you. Oh, yeah, please.
Thank you, Sister, for a remarkable synthesis of ideas. You covered so much in such a short period of time,
Really visit to
and in
Louis.
an engaging way, I thought. I hope you all found it as engaging as I found it, too. Sister is willing to listen to, answer some questions. And I forgot to say at the beginning, so everybody take out your pen and paper, think about your question. Especially those of you at home, you can write a question to an email address, write to askus@louisu.edu. So please, those of you who are live streaming, ask, as in ask a question, ask us at louisu.edu, and one of my colleagues will look for questions. Otherwise, the rest of you are open to ask questions of Sister Ilya. And I think Margaret has a microphone. Everybody look around and see Margaret. And if you raise your hand, everybody should raise their hand.
I'm not going to run up and walk the question.
Thank you, Sister. I was wondering, how would you define or describe the Eucharist, given this approach that you shared with us?
Yes. I would like to think of the Eucharist as the body and blood of Christ in the sense that God is deeply present in that material, bread and wine, and therefore, in a sense, we become, if I can use that word, entangled with God. In other words, that become consciously aware. First of all, I don't think we're always consciously aware of what that sacramental bread and wine is about. One thing this does do, and so let me be honest, because quantum physics is calling us to rethink the term nature. So, traditionally we have the two natures of Jesus, divinity and humanity, united in a perfect exchange. And the term entanglement is used here just as an introduction, a new way to think about nature in that divinity and humanity. I would like to think, if we can think of the Eucharist in terms of entanglement, that God's life is deeply now entangled with my life. That Eucharist then becomes what I'm about. That the life of Christ is not just outside me, now it is me. And so therefore, partaking of that universe, therefore, is building up that Christic presence, or the presence of Christ in the world. And our job is to take it from the altar out into the world, that it becomes then that body in the world. Yeah.
I was wanting you to run across. Thank you so much for all your comments, and I have a number of words I'll be looking up later, so I'm just going to put that out there.
Sorry.
I wondered if it kind of tags on to Father's question, and you talked about the current thinning out of connectedness, and I wondered if you could speak to something I've experienced of sort of right now a human resistance to coming away from that thinning out toward contemplation and connection, and how do we foster that and invite that and
Yes.
be a part of that?
Yeah, that's very good. I mean, I think the renewal of contemplation and mysticism in our own time is two things. One, I think we're beginning to realize the importance of mindfulness, that we have become so caught up in progress and busyness of the doing. We have the need to slow down and realize this mind that is at the heart of our embodied life. So that's one thing that's super important, and that's quite consonant with a mind-matter holism. But there's also something else going on here, and that is, I think technology has hacked the mind In other words, from mid-20th century on, we've been able to allow that mind to be exported out of ourselves. And I think there's something in us that fears losing our mind to technology. And I think there's an effort here to conserve it, and because it is to be able to experience, to be able to think, to be able to hope and dream and create what doesn't exist. This makes us human. And we have a question of humanity at stake here today. And so I think it's great to focus on contemplation, but I'd like to shift that from just a contemplation that's passive to a contemplation that actively engages the world. That as we begin to focus our minds on that presence of God within, we can begin to see that the same God active and alive in everything we're about. Because it's really us as creatively engaged that will either brings God to a more explicit, a presence in the world, present as peace, present as justice, present as charity, as compassion, or it doesn't, or we remain, enclosed. Honestly, I fear the termination of our speech. I fear the termination of the human with technology. And so I'm 100% for contemplation, and I want it to be, in a sense, engaged with evolution in this unfolding of life.
Hi, I really appreciate this speech that you brought us to us. I enjoy the evolution theory that you mentioned, and I have a question about the ChatGPT that you talked about. If we depend
About the what, DVD?
if we depend on AI, like AI technology a lot, would that stop evolutionizing us as a community closer to the God, such as you said, love and safety?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually, because, some of my work, so I do a lot of work in artificial intelligence and human becoming. And just yesterday, I was talking with my students. If you look at the trends, the things that we're now spending research money on are brain downloading, digital immortality, and hybridizing humans and robots. Now, the fear, of course, is that we will develop super intelligent robots that will eventually replace or supplant the human. That's a problem on many levels. First of all, so we humans don't get it right? We mess up. But guess what? It gives us a capacity to try again. So striving, weakness, suffering, the ability to be compassionate, that's where love really is fostered. Can a robot love? Can a robot really feel? We are trying to build robots that will feel. One of the things is, again, this is why I feel religion and evolution need to really come together. We have to get our heads around how science and religion can work together. Because when you read the literature on technology, one of Ray Kurzweil, who's one of the famous futurists here, he says, the roots of technology are in the Judeo-Christian tradition, salvation and immortality. Now they say we can save ourselves and we can become immortal with technology. But is that what we hope for? Does that give us the fullness of life? I don't think so. And so Tayard himself said technology is a good, but we have to control its powers. So all I'm saying is here, we're too passive with regard to technology. We have not taken an active stance on how, we even have purchase power. So if you just buy everything that comes off the, right onto the screen, I need to get it. I need it, you'll be going, I need a chip for my brain, because I don't have enough memory, or, and we seamlessly move into the latest technological development. And we don't stop and think, why should we get this? What will it do for us? So the question is, what do we value as humans, as children of God? What do we really value, and what are we willing to do to allow those values to grow in a healthy, hopeful way, in a way consonant with God's vision for this creation?
Thank you very much. You've given me so much to think about. One of the things that I'm struggling with right now is, in the framework of wholeness and entanglement, what is the role for individuality?
Yes, absolutely, right. So there is, funny enough, because this stuff is always counterintuitive, quite honestly. Wholeness sounds like the homogeneous, we're all in this together type thing. You know, sort of like a giant Packers game, and the stadiums are filled with like, 100,000 people, and you can't tell one from the other. But actually, love is always particular, right? It's the particularity. It's as if, from a quantum perspective, there's all these potentials. I'm going to put it this way. But God knew, I have known you, right? Before, what's the Psalm 108? Even while you were in your mother's womb, I knew you. That knowing that is the particularity that says, well, you could have been everything, but you're this. You are this person, and this person bears God's love in an infinite way, an unclonable way. And therefore, I think holism is such that it's the particularity of the uniqueness of individuals that is the common whole. Like every person has a particular love, and that's what we share together. Beauty is the harmony of contrasts. Beauty is not everything the same. I mean, flowers have this beautiful harmony. Like, one flower is different from another, and a leaf is different from another. It's the complementarity of parts that creates this unified whole. I always liken it to a stained glass window. Every person is like a fractal of glass. And in that fractal of glass, the divine light shines through in a particular way. Now, if I take only that fractal of glass all by itself, I would say, oh, that's just a fractal of glass, not too much. I put that fractal of glass into this whole, and it shines in this, it contributes to this whole in this magnificent way. So each of us has this beauty of divine light or divine love. And it's how we contribute that love with all other fractals of love that creates the whole. Are you tired now?
I want to say again, too, I mentioned a remarkable synthesis. An insider comment, when she said contemplation and engagement with the world, spoken like a true Franciscan, right? And I would even say the Christian Brothers follow that same maxim, contemplation but with engagement with the world. So thank you very much for a wonderful talk,
Thanks.
sister.
Yeah, thank you.